Well, for everyone out there, welcome to welcome to Live Summit, and welcome to our panel, which is on what what it takes to be an AI first company and building an AI first startup. So it's great to have everyone here. My name is Straus, and I am managing director of KUNGFU.AI, and we are an AI professional services firm. I characterize my career by saying I'm a serial entrepreneur. KUNGFU is my fifth startup, and a former venture capitalist. I spent 9 years at what was at the time the largest venture firm between the two coasts, Austin Ventures, and we had $3 billion under management. And I've been building KUNGFU.AI, which is an AI professional services firm, for the last 3 years. And I bring a VC and an entrepreneur's perspective to this panel. And with me, I have Erick Moen, who is with Caltech, who brings a university innovation perspective. Spencer Ward, who is with Anthem, who brings a corporate innovation perspective. And Steve Minton, who is the president of Inferlink, also an entrepreneur's perspective. And so I think you're going to see that we have some really interesting different ways that we look at the question that we're going to talk about here. And before I let everyone introduce themselves, I'm just going to quickly lay out the overview of the program that we're going to be here. So we're going to have a panel discussion for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And please feel free to ask any questions and comments in the comment tab. The first topic we're going to tee up is, what is an AI first company? Simple. We're going to debate that and discuss that and hopefully make that clear. The second topic we're going to talk about is, what are the opportunities for AI first companies in the healthcare and the biotech industries? And then the third topic is, what challenges are associated with AI in the healthcare and biotechnology industries? So I think by the end of our panel discussion, you'll have gotten a lot out of it. And I'm going to now ask, I'll start with you, Steve. If you could just introduce yourself and just give a little context about yourself as it relates to this topic, and then we'll go around the horn and then jump into the first question. Steve.
Thanks, Steven. Appreciate it. My background is I'm an AI scientist. I've been that for my entire career, both in private industry. I've worked in government and education. I got my PhD from CMU ages ago. I worked at NASA, Ames Research Center, and I taught the machine learning course at Stanford. I actually started that course. I founded the Journal of AI Research, which is a leading journal, academic journal in AI, and I then became an entrepreneur, and I've co-founded 7 AI-related companies since I started doing this, and right now I'm working at Inferlink. And what we do is do consulting, so we do strategic consulting and build software and so forth. We also do a lot of government-funded research for DARPA and other folks like that. So we try to keep our hand in cutting edge stuff. And looking forward to talking about the startup view of AI first companies here.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Steve. And Spencer, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. Happy to be here. Nice to meet everyone. Spencer Ward. Right now, I'm a digital solutions director, technology manager at Anthem. Product lead for our digital data sandbox, which is one of the world's largest private certified de-identified healthcare data sets. We primarily use that for engaging and evaluating third-party tech, what I would consider pressure testing, AI and machine learning solutions, but it also powers a lot of our collaboration engagements, both with academics and global researchers and developers. Prior to that, I've had over a decade in emergency medicine and standing up sales and customer success operations for international software companies, and kind of stumbled into the data realm. So self-taught in AI and machine learning, mainly through the data lens as it pertained to data governance. So that's me.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Spencer. And last but not least, Erick.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Erick Moen. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Caltech in the biological engineering department. So we're actually trying to bring some of that industry rigor that is developed and expected in most software to the academic environment, which there's a lot of really cool cutting edge stuff happening as you can imagine, but to be able to make that useful, you have to be able to make it reliable, make questions available, be able to provide users with what they need and understanding that. From a what can we do with deep learning to a what can we actually help people, or what do they want to do, have turned out to be two very different questions. Before that, I got my PhD in applied physics from USC, where I did a lot of biophysics work. I've also spent about a decade in outside consulting, trying to help startups pitch their ideas to the studios around Los Angeles, as well as help those studios understand which of these upcoming features and companies are going to be important to key in on over the next 5 to 10 years. So very excited to talk to everyone today.
Well, thank you, Eric. Well, let's jump right in. So as I said, the first topic we're going to talk about is what is an AI first company? But what I'd really like to do is start even one level up higher than that. And Eric, I'm going to aim this at you. But could you just help everyone in the audience with what is a good working definition of AI before we talk about what AI first is?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because it is a buzzword, and so everyone's very excited to talk about it, but there are so many different domains with which you can use AI, and I'm sure Steve probably has a lot to say about like expert systems from the 80s and why we do things the way we do now versus simple machine learning tasks that's often the most useful, things like clustering or just normal regression. Whenever we say AI these days, I think most people are probably going to CNNs, and that's because of the success that ImageNet has had in allowing us to do object recognition. And so that's a very different ballgame, and that is almost completely because it's supervised learning. It requires good data and good data governance, and that's something in the healthcare industry that can be quite challenging. So you have these different the unsupervised route, which is a little bit more simplistic but incredibly useful, ranging all the way up to the supervised route, which will have some data issues that I'm sure we'll get into as the panel progresses.
Spencer and Steve, do you want to add anything to a definition of AI?
I will say it's a moving target. You know, things that you thought were AI then turn out to be people saying that's not AI. So when you sort of figure out how to do it, it becomes not AI anymore. But generally speaking, I think of it as, you know, things that we would say just intuitively require intelligence, and trying to get a computer to do that. People in AI, you know, scientists who are in academia actually argue about this. I learned not to argue, but you still see it a lot of times.
Yeah.
A friend of mine had a paper submitted, and she's a very well-known AI scientist. Our whole group submitted something to a journal, and one of the reviews came back and said, "This isn't AI." So hard to say.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm going to make this a jump ball, so the three of you can decide who wants to take it first. But we just did a quick overview of what is AI. So who wants to tackle what is an AI first company at a high level?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take that. I think, you know, the way we think about it, at least at Anthem, you know, starting really specifically with the problem, and I think having the AI lens on things is understanding specifically, I think, where AI can be impactful and where it can't. And I think when we think about just the general, you know, patient experience, where AI is most sensible, is there a possibility for you know, intelligence to either make some process more efficient or make it more precise? I think, you know, just having that sort of lens of where there can be an augmentation of maybe a completely manual or human process, I think is important, particularly when you think about it. So I think it's really goes back to just general mindset and actually, you know, deeply cultural when you think about being an AI first business. That's what I would say.
All right, Steve and Eric, you want to pile on?
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time for startups because I think we've spoken in the past about maybe mobile first eras. This is a fun time to think about how you're organizing your data so that you can set yourself up for success. Because with some of the larger companies, there can be a struggle of getting access to the data lakes, properly organizing that, making it available even. There may be these opportunities that even these larger companies see to make use of this data, but because of the way it's siloed, it's very difficult to get access to that. So for startups especially, they need to be thinking about how they're storing that data, how they're versioning it, making sure that data that shows up badly or models that show up badly are taken care of and properly versioned, so they're not going to run into just an issue of just too much bad data or not even knowing where to go with it.
Steve?
I think that Spencer and Eric have really pointed out the most important things about an AI first company, things like the culture and the data, thinking hard about the data, as Eric was saying. So I'll just sort of say what I think it's not.
Yeah.
That is, some folks, to them, AI first, maybe it's like, it's all about the AI, right? And startups especially, this is a classic mistake. I mean, I'm sure that there'll be some companies out there that make a lot of money by just doing purely AI and doing cool stuff. But typically, your company's got to be about the business value that you're returning, and not about the AI. So being an AI first company may be hard, think about the culture and the data, super important, but not necessarily just doing AI.
I love that point, because we saw that early in grant writing, is you could just sort of sprinkle AI or deep learning on top of something and you could really easily get it funded. We're well beyond that now. We need to be showing what the actual use case is, what the user base is, being able to make the market comparisons and showing what it can do, not just talking about it being a nice feature that's sort of nebulous.
Yep. Those are the conversations I've had, Eric, with academics that we partner with, that we collaborate with, is actually bringing the use case. Where's the actual impact in an enterprise from a business perspective, the actual application? I think if the use case maybe has that origination in the enterprise, coming back to the academics where there's expertise, creates a really nice medley for actually operationalizing something, making impact.
Yeah, and you see that because it's such a black box that I think some folks, especially in the startup world, may be scared of letting that out, and so they just sort of continue to use that black box framework. But as we're seeing, the decision making is going to be a real important part of that. So we can't even just treat it as a black box that will solve all things. We really need to be able to show transparency and how some of those decisions are being made, and help people see the real value and benefit to these systems.
Absolutely.
When we were preparing for this, we were, or I was trying to draw a distinction between an AI first and an AI forward company. Spencer, would you like to see if you could draw that distinction out for people to understand that?
Yeah, I mean, I think forward versus first, right? When I first think about it, it still goes back. I appreciate Eric's point on just the organization of the data itself. I think Tesla had positioned themselves really well of doing data capture and acquisition and understanding what the potential downstream consumption might look like. So setting up that upstream capture and acquisition and storage and making that kind of understanding the full life cycle of the data itself and beginning with the end in mind from that perspective. I think that was kind of leaning in to being a little bit more AI forward, where AI first, if you're thinking about that would have been maybe an AI first approach. But the AI forward, I think, is, I think there's leaning into, or maybe even dabbling in that world where first understanding that not everything is an AI problem. I think that's just really critical. Just anecdotally, we've been thinking about obesity and how individuals, particularly those that fare with COVID over the last year and change, is those with obesity typically tend to do poor. Those are the ones that are typically hospitalized. And when we think about that, it becomes pretty binary of being able to understand whether someone is overweight or obese. And right now we typically use BMI within the clinical setting to determine that. But whether we actually need AI, whether we need to insert AI into that to understand, okay, is this individual obese, or do they have are they at risk or a propensity for becoming obese depending upon their lifestyle, versus actually instituting a behavioral change through an application or through some other digital technology or engagement with that member, with that individual. I think that's just a really important distinction that we typically make is just when is AI appropriate, instead of just rushing to being AI first. I think we'd say, okay, well, we're AI forward. We can certainly have an augmentation here, like, connecting in AI where it makes sense, but let's not rush to have that be the be all end all, is how I typically decipher that.
Yeah, and I think the data and the infrastructure are incredibly important, right? So the data can prevent you from being able to handle certain problems. You may not be able to know what you can train for because it may not be all in the same place. But even the infrastructure, let's say a startup comes up and has this really idea for a model, but those models live in notebooks and they're never able to be prepped or handed around, or the model is living in a notebook and it becomes stale because of the data that's dependent on it. Are you going to have those models deployed in a federated way? Are they going to be deployed on mobile? Are they going to be deployed in the cloud? Are you making these things available to folks in that way? Because you could really quickly, because of how quickly all the systems, the supporting systems move, you could be obsolete even if you are a brand new startup with complete control of your data. You might be locked into a certain TensorFlow workspace that just doesn't even exist in a year.
Yeah, and let me give you a perspective I have, which is I think of AI forward, I guess, is kind of a way station for existing larger companies as they try to get to AI first status. So almost every company on the planet hasn't started down the AI journey, and so as they dip their toe in the water, they're not AI forward or AI first. But when they really lean into it to try to really remake their companies, they're going to really try to put AI forward within their business. And it's not until they, reorganize themselves and reorient themselves fully to AI that they can become an AI first company. And so I look at it as a major milestone and way station for larger existing companies on the path towards really fully embracing what it means to compete in the age of AI. So
yeah. It's a great point. Just to add to that too, because I think that's really salient with also what Erick had said is, part of this is, are we, as a company, like, are you missing a trend by not partaking? And that's like trend based versus, are you missing a protocol? Are you missing a standard that's developing? From a company perspective in an enterprise, we might say, okay, this is where, we might have some sort of regulatory, change in the regulatory landscape, right? That the federal government or lobbyists within the healthcare system are instituting this change, this protocol, this standard. And by not partaking, like, are we, so I think that's just the difference too, is, standard and protocol versus just a general trend, and making that switch too, which might actually, kind of align with the trajectory of forward to first.
Well, excellent. I think we could probably spend a bunch more time on this topic and go deeper, but we have 3 topics, and I want to make sure we spend spread our time out on the 3. So with your permission, I'm going to move on to topic 2, which are, what are the opportunities for AI first companies in the healthcare and biotechnology industries? And Erick, I'm going to ask you to start with just the difference between healthcare versus biotechnology in this context.
Yeah, I think Spencer brought it up really well earlier, that there's so many different segments. And so trying to cover both healthcare and biotechnology in one idea and even approaching them with the same mindset is really difficult. There's all manner of regulatory agencies. The closer you get to the patient, the more difficult it's going to be to kind of have these new things make a difference. You just have to think about a completely different problem set than if you're working maybe in the research or translational space, where there's a very simple process that could be sped up dramatically by an application of maybe even some sort of simple type of AI. But these areas really bifurcate because of the ethics around the data, and do we have data available to even train these sort of supervised methods? And in most cases, the answer to that is no. Or if it's not, then making the agreements that you'd need to make to get a hold of that data and being able to deal with the licensing, the IP, and everything that goes along with that can become incredibly complicated, especially for a startup who may have a very set burn rate. If you're trying to go close to the patient or clinicians, you could very quickly play yourself out of this game.
So, Steve, I'm going to ask you to talk. You've worked in both healthcare and biotech. Very different as from their orientation as it relates to technology. Can you maybe talk about some of the differences, but also where you see the opportunities as you look out into the future?
Sure. In the biotech area, it's super exciting. It's such a high tech area. There's definitely people are interested in AI. The people that work there, they're already sort of high tech people. Everyone in the biotech area, understands technology and values it. So you walk in, sort of people are interested in what you're doing. On the other hand, it's also hard to exceed because the bar is high because there are good people using all sorts of technologies there. And the nice thing about biotech is that some of the data is not that hard to get. I've done some stuff, for example, where we've been analyzing articles, abstracts in PubMed, for example. 38 million abstracts in PubMed, they're right there for the taking and for the analyzing. And there's all sorts of interesting things, we've been able to do there and with those types of data sources. And there's just a ton of different types of data in biotech. But it's it's a fast-moving game. Healthcare, on the other hand, is as Erick was saying, it was alluded to earlier in a couple different ways. It's a slow-moving game, just because if you do anything, it's close to the patient. There are big companies. Everything moves slowly, and that's a lot of what I refer to as calcified ways of doing things that you'd think that we could invent a much better way of doing, but it's really hard to make those things work and change a big ecosystem like that. Nevertheless, there's a lot of possibility there because, the thing about working in healthcare is, you can see the results, the patients if you can affect their health, that's tremendously rewarding. I think that motivates a lot of people at startups and elsewhere. Just sometimes you have to deal with the frustration, and as just said, you really have to make sure you've got a timeline that's going to really work there.
Even the way you raise money is completely different because of you have these sort of biotech VCs that are going to give you tens to $100 million to build up your wet lab space versus the tech bio companies that sort of really, they know they can get in for $1 million. They want to try and get something 10x still, but you're very much focused on the software. You don't need the wet lab as much. And so you have to sort of decide early as a startup, which of those realms are you going to try and play in?
So let's talk about let's segment them out. Now that we've talked about the differences, et cetera. I would love to hear. Let's start with the healthcare side. With respect to the patient journey, where are the opportunities do you see? And one way to talk about this is: are there startups or companies out there that you are particularly excited about as a way to illustrate, where you see the opportunities? Help people out there think through what they might want to do if they wanted to start a company in this space. Who'd like to take that in the healthcare side, and then we'll switch to biotech in a minute.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that on the healthcare side. I think what's really important is understanding at the beginning, and kind of said, where the problem is, but also who the consumers are. When we think about it as the second largest payer in the US at Anthem, what really is our role if we're trying to impact, the provider versus the member? What does that actually look like from a delivery perspective of the actual solution? So, just as an example, we had been evaluating this company that, I guess let's start with originating the problem first. Standard of care for women under the age of 40 managing breast cancer prediction risk is relatively poor. As far as when mammography is actually indicated for routine mammography, not generally until after 40. And so typically diagnoses under the age of 40 are made very late stage, and the prognosis is awfully poor, typically. So it would therefore be in our best interest to have some sort of methodology or some sort of mechanism of being able to predict early breast cancer risk. And we know we have this from a biotech perspective, that there's mechanisms of doing that with the BRCA gene. But whether there's any sort of modeling that we can do, even from a claims perspective, just thinking about it of, given the data I have, is there anything I can do here? So there's some companies in the space that we've certainly evaluated and worked with to determine whether there's validity in the approach. But I think that's a very specific problem, and obviously you want to have that growth arc or that growth trajectory as a business to say. I think it's very easy to then grow that into, okay, now it's women's health, and that's fine, or cancer care, right? And then, okay, we can do this for this one diagnosis, but can we do this for many other different types of cancer? I think even as I'm talking through this as an enterprise, I think we have to be respectful of the startup's position on where their core competency lies. And I think understanding specifically, if I come in and say, this is the problem, can you solve it? And they say, yes, we can. Okay, great. But can you do, these 10 other, can you diagnose these risk stratification for 10 other conditions or whatever it is? I think it's okay to have, I think we expect that everything should be this fully baked, comprehensive, end-to-end solution. But I think it's okay, particularly in the AI sense, to say whether something fits in as a puzzle piece of being just a point solution in managing risk stratification or wherever it is in the health continuum. So I think uniquely too, and then I'll stop talking, is healthcare is an experience that we all have. It's not like we're talking about modeling for investment banking or something where there's a group of people who have an expertise or that's their day-to-day. Healthcare is something that we all generally experience, we experience it. And I think humanizing that, understanding that it's an experience that we all have, that even reflecting on your own experience ultimately probably informs or encourages startup founders and entrepreneurs to solve a problem. I know that's company that I started my career with was Patient Pop here in Silicon Beach in LA, and was founded out of that there was long wait times in the waiting room, frustrations over even just scheduling an appointment with your OBGYN as a pregnant spouse. So I think that's, not to complicate things. I think that's where I'd land. Invite Stephen or Erick to opine on that. But
yeah, Steve. You've got experience in this space.
Yeah, well, I mean, doing a startup, for example, or start launching new business, it's all about the creativity of coming up with something that different from what I'm about to say, because it's always something, you want to be new and different. There's lots and lots of possibilities. But I will say, responding a little bit to some of the things that Spencer brought up, the $1 million, if we could solve the diagnostics problem, right? Do a better job of inserting technology somewhere to really help diagnostics. That's what, there's such a huge potential there, and everyone knows it, right? But, everyone's also struggling with how do we make this work? So, doctors don't want to be replaced. There's some questions about, how to best help them do what they do. There's the fact that everyone is worried about risk and so forth. And one of the things, it's sort of funny because you can kind of compare it to self-driving cars, okay, which I think is it's interesting to look at what Tesla is doing because they're just going ahead and doing it, right, in spite of the risk. I tend to think it's a little crazy, and I worry about it, and I like the way Waymo's doing stuff, but they're just out there, driving cars.
Well, more than just driving cars, they're downloading new updates on the fly. Like,
I know, it's unbelievable.
You wake up one morning and your car has new features.
Which is sort of my point, which is I never would have predicted that these guys would be out there doing that. I mean, that's why maybe Elon Musk is like a zillionaire and I'm not. But so it could be the case that one of these days in the diagnostics world, someone's just going to come in there and just do a great job with diagnostics and figure out how to make it work in spite of all the risk issues, and will surprise us all. But right now, the problem is, it's a complicated thing. So how do you insert your technology in the right way that's going to make a difference? Tricky.
Absolutely tricky.
And I tend to go the other way because as awesome as all the self-driving cars are, we're still at level 4. And the jury's out on whether or not we're ever going to get to level 5. And that's because they started with the easy stuff, right? Can we keep a car in front of us at a certain distance? And I think that when we bring it back to, especially as we get close to the patient, can we help just in pathology? alleviate some of the burden on the pathologist, where they're having to go through hundreds of slides a day. They don't want to do that work. And so that might be a place where you can sort of de-risk that. If you can de-risk it enough to say that, yes, there's nothing interesting going on in the slide, but the one time you miss the interesting thing on the slide, that's when everyone gets really, really antsy. And whether or not you can get the FDA to sign off on that, or whether you need some sort of an adapted protocol that would let you go through multiple rounds in multiple different ways, could that be done? But again, as a startup now, you're partnering with a very large company to try to get that done for one specific use case, hoping that some other field can then change the regulatory agencies and everything behind it, and then get buy-in from the folks that are actually doing the work, not to mention the patients themselves. So you enter all of those issues when you get towards the healthcare realm. Whereas in the, like, we'll take pathology again, there are a ton of tests that get done that would greatly benefit from all manner of computer vision. These models get published and are out there right now. All they need is data. And so could someone come along and just help sort of the research end of things with a specific disease in a specific area, and then be able to grow that feature into some company that may eventually down the line do something like Path.AI, where they're able to do like tumor heat maps and so on.
Well, let's switch the topic to biotech. So where are the opportunities? Can you name any startups that you think are particularly exciting? Who wants to jump in on this one?
I think Path.AI is the one. I mean, they're not really, like, I don't know if you call them a startup anymore, but they're definitely doing very exciting work. They're really going to change, I think, the way digital pathology is viewed. That's the one that comes at least to the top of my mind.
I think I just want to mention something that's not a startup. I think was really exciting that
Sure.
Probably a lot of people know about, but I think it's really fundamental from an AI point of view, which is, what DeepMind is doing on the protein folding stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, those guys are so good. Okay. The stuff that's come out of that, that laboratory is incredible. But I think that can have some big ramifications down the line. And the fact that they could pull that off is really a great thing for AI and sort of illustrates the promise there. So anyway, it's a big deal, I think.
It is a big deal. I agree.
I think along with that, there's some really good research. I think it's coming out of like MIT and Harvard, where they're looking at all these drugs that have already passed FDA 1. So they're not going to cause any damage, but they just didn't do what we were hoping that they would do. So now, can we look at some conformational changes? Can we start dumping those in a dish and just see with some sort of AI-powered computer vision whether or not they might have some characteristics that will be able to treat things? So it's not a startup yet, but again, this, as you mentioned, some of that data is out there. So this could be done now.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's a really exciting thing as well. And the nice thing is, we were all talking about how slow everything is. And, if you're a startup, you want to succeed quickly and so forth. The nice thing about this stuff that's been already approved by the FDA for use is that, that's one of the biggest things that slows you down is all the FDA approval stuff. I mean, that's just it's very important. You can see the importance of the FDA. I'm
I like having them there. I feel more safe.
Yeah, I mean, that's it's a great organization in a lot of ways. But, we pay also a huge cost. It's a long, slow, expensive process as a result.
Yeah. I mean, as far as creating a glide path, I think that's, the fact that you already maybe have this scaffolding in the spirit of the name of this talk, right? You have a foundation off of which to work. You're not starting net new. I think understanding whether there's been headway on something that maybe just, it didn't materialize, but picking that back up and maybe looking at it in a different way from a different angle, I think is an interesting way to think about things, particularly as a potential founder.
And so we're talking about startups, that customer discovery is so important. You hear it from day one of business school, but if you're going and talking to folks either in the healthcare space or in the biotechnology space, or even those that are working on diseases, and find out what the technicians are really struggling with and what they would love to do, because there's some brilliant technicians out there who just think that what they do is normal now, and they may be using 3 or 4 different programs and doing different file formats and trying to push things from one place to another. there is a lot of lost time, and a little bit of ingenuity there could bring them some great relief and be something that they would be able to then pitch to their managers, and that can start a business.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, in the interest of time, my job is to keep us moving, and I'm going to switch us to the third topic, which is really a variant on the one we were just talking about. So we were just talking about opportunities in healthcare and biotech. Now we're going to talk about challenges associated with healthcare and biotech. So I'll pick on you, Erick. Could you maybe expound a little bit on data and privacy, data as it relates to privacy and ethics?
Yeah, and whether we're talking about I'll speak primarily on the biotech side, the technology research side, because that's where I'm working. There, we spend a great deal of time trying to pull more information out of the data that we have available, and that's because these cohorts, they're humans. They have like everything that goes along with that, all the stress, the worry, and because of that, there's some very good rules in place about what you can and can't do with that data. And some of the things that we may need to build new AI systems, we just simply don't have access to, because either that is from slides that have been available from different medical imaging cores for years, or it's something that we haven't thought to test yet. And because of that, the data really is king. And these medical imaging cores know what they have. So even to start being able to play in that area, like we'll go back to Path AI and digital pathology, like being able to pull the H&E slides alone is not a simple procedure. And then understanding if we could just had this piece of data or this information about the cohort, we might have been able to make this big breakthrough. But there are a whole host of privacy issues that goes along with getting that information and even passing them from one company to another. If you're a subsidiary and kind of trying to hook into an Anthem, we'll say, there's a whole bunch of data use agreements that must be handled correctly. And that's going to affect the data shape that you have. And since most of the really awesome research you hear about is supervised learning, it basically takes that off the table because you just simply wouldn't have access to it. And that's why I think a lot of the startups that are starting with wet labs inside, so they actually can craft their own data systems. And we talked about being AI first, having that data and being able to generate your own data alongside the models and the workflows that you're doing, that is really key at this stage.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Spencer.
Well, I was just, I mean, from an ethics perspective, and even just, it's interesting, as product lead for the Anthem Digital Data Sandbox, we had a decision to make, and, we could either pull the reins and say, we're not going to do this. Data sharing is hard, right? Like data collaboration, being able to make data available for consumption by third parties, whether it's even a high trust relationship where it's an established vendor partnership versus something that's, brand new with relatively low or zero trust. I mean, I think having a framework in place, having, I'm a big proponent for good governance. And I know that's a loaded word. I know that a lot goes into it. But I think rather than just box checking, I think having folks from legal, from regulatory compliance, from, we have a newly found Office of Responsible AI, having those folks with a seat at the table rather than just box checking, I think has been an absolute game changer for us, because it's not just advisory or consultancy on here's the things you need to be thinking about. Like we're starting at the beginning with them having a say in what we're doing, and therefore they have the degree of foresight to say, and they're innovative enough to understand that there might be some new technology or these use cases that we haven't yet thought about. Just for example, we've been a unilateral contributor of our certified de-identified data in our engagements to date. We allow third-party startups to, bring in their containerized applications or their starter scripts or even their code base for their apps into the environment, but not necessarily any additional data feeds that are originating through any trials or pilots that they're doing. But that's an emerging use case. We know that could unlock a heap of value if we're able to conduct row-level merges in a privacy-preserving way. But back to Erick's point, it's like being able to marry that with and track the through line of permitted use as it relates to data sharing agreements, and looking at it as a data flows problem, and understanding that wherever there's a a human in the mix, it's an opportunity for either slowdown or for human error, I think is interesting. But I'll stop with saying that I did have a conversation with a chief data officer of one of the 50 states. He had said, left me with one imparting wisdom, which was that good governance is participatory governance. You need to have people that participate. And, I think that's just really important. Designing a system that has that governance over it. And even if it's maybe we need a new word for governance because it's so loaded. But anyways, I think good governance is a glide path to doing things well.
Hey, Spencer, I have a question for you. I think you hit on a good point, which is the whole, sharing data thing. With there's been a lot of technology advances in the past few years where people are trying to, share securely. So there's a huge opportunity there. Where do you think it's going to go? Do you see that that's going to explode and we're going to solve this problem, or is it just going to be mired in red tape forever?
It's a really good question. I coming from an Australian tech company previously that was in the space, they have a regulatory landscape that has lent itself to setting up these guardrails since, maybe the late 90s, early 2000s versus, we know the emergence of GDPR in the European Union. We know with California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, what that has done for data rights and privacy management. I think, when it first happens, the institution of just standing up these legal guardrails, it kind of jolts people and there's some unease. But I think after that, it kind of relaxes a little bit. And like there's some very interesting models related to like the emergence of GDPR. And there was a lot of concern initially of that stifling innovation. But I think as long as you know the rules of the road, it creates an opportunity for, right now, a lot of folks will refer to it as like the wild, wild west. It's, you kind of make it up as you go and you hope you're doing the right thing. I think it's also really important to understand what our developers need. When we're interfacing with developers on the outside, understanding whether, synthetic data is going to be enough, whether the certified, de-identified data is going to be enough. I think if we're actually evaluating like model performance and we're talking about, evaluating bias and things in models, like it all goes back to the underlying data. And, I think the space itself also with different compute mechanisms, we're talking about like homomorphic encryption and federated learning. I think there's a lot of things that are emerging that, if we look to our friends in the East and in the APAC region, like these have been technologies and mechanisms of data sharing have existed for a while that have unlocked use cases in anti-money laundering in the financial space for a long time. If you look at just the maturity of the financial space in the APAC region, and you think about a core use case, like as an enterprise, a big bank in the APAC region wanted to collaborate with a fintech. They've had a framework that allowed them to do that for a long time. And there was a need to do that because there was impending disruption. I think the same thing's happening in healthcare, where there's this impending need to be able to collaborate as a large payer, as a large enterprise with a health tech. And how do I do that? I think there can be some lessons learned, not only through different parts of the world of how they're doing it, but also different industries.
But I also, since you have, I'll be a little bit pointed. So you have all of the data, you have it anonymized, but even we kind of talk about it as anonymized and think, oh, we're done. But now we have, how much have we reduced the utility? How much anonymization have we actually introduced? And even with homomorphic encryption, the throughput's incredibly low. So yeah, there's some things there. And I guess from the startup perspective, there's a lot of opportunity, but those are still open issues.
100%. It's a constant trying to strike a balance, right? The utility, privacy, it's tough. And I think that's where, I think you had said it before, is going back to like your consumer, who your end user is. Like, I have conversations with our developers constantly. Is this good enough? Is it not enough? What is enough? There's a lot of unknowns, but as long as we're asking those questions, I think, there's give and take, right? We come with the use case, we come with a lot of domain expertise, we understand how to operationalize some of these things, and there's expertise on the other side. And I think it lends itself to a lot of really rich collaborations that, we might otherwise not have ever been able to unlock if we didn't just make our data available and wrangle it and process it in a way that, could be served in a safe and secure way. So.
And I think that's absolutely huge, because even in the academic realms now, we're seeing companies back research agendas that create data that then that data becomes siloed in one way or another. Either it's kind of stuck in the research area, and every single company is trying to figure, or every single research lab is trying to figure out how to fund even this data research. And so it's leading to, unfortunately, an even more fragmented data environment. So I really appreciate you making that available. Some of that's going to be the privatization along with it, so we can understand how to further that research as well. But I think collaboration is going to be huge. I'm concerned that we might be losing a little bit of that going forward.
Yeah.
Well, let me interject here for just a moment. We have a little less than 15 minutes left in this panel, and I would love to take questions from the audience. So please type them into the comments panel, and I will get to those. But with that said, Steve, do you want to talk about we're talking about challenges associated with AI in the healthcare and biotech industries. When we were preparing for this, you made a comment about the time cycles are very long and how that plays into it. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I just mean that's more on the on the biotech side, it shows up in anything that's FDA related. But on the health side, well, FDA is there too. But we've just, I've been struck by just how long, it takes to make, a big, buying decisions, for example. If you're talking about one of the large providers, and there's sort of been a lot of merging and coalescing, so now larger and larger providers, and sort of everything is slow as far as I can tell. So if if you're trying to sell something to providers, whether it's a point of care or doesn't really matter. It's just a long, slow sales cycle, and that can be something you don't take into account if you're an entrepreneur.
Yeah, it can be deadly.
Yeah, I think that's certainly an inherent value in working with these startups that we are is just like time to value. I mean, of course, as an enterprise, and I think that's important to realize, and I think a lot of startups do, is there is always that inherent build versus buy decision that you can just assume the enterprise is making behind the scenes, right? But I think really putting a stake in the ground and using that as an advantage in part of the pitch to a large enterprise, I think has inherent value. So.
All right, well, I think you all can see the question that's in the comments, but I'm going to read it out loud for the benefit of the people who might watch this on the recording. But Alan has our first question from the audience, and please send more. But I'll toss the question out, and you all can take it as you please. Have any of you seen a reliable solution or vendor who can aggregate patient-level data for health outcomes after a surgery, ER visit, hospital admission, etc., especially if a patient is treated outside of their primary network?
No, I'm not familiar with anybody.
I tend to think that those sorts of solutions are only going to be available from something like a Kaiser, something that's completely vertically integrated, just because of all the data privacy and ethics concerns we were talking about. And then you enter, I think it's a very good thing to point out that outside of network, because as soon as you leave the network again, you might have had that within the vertical integration, and you may not have this. I was thinking about this just with vaccinations the other day. I went to get a flu shot and I have a receipt. Unless I keep that receipt or save it somewhere, I will forget very quickly when or where that came from or what dosage vial, anything. And having all those records is a pain point for the consumer, but it is a very difficult problem to solve, to keep track of that data in a privacy-aware way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of mechanisms. There's a few players that are trying to do this, but you got to have adoption for there to be impact. And I think even with like Apple Health, like there's the opportunity for Erick to log his vaccination in the Apple Health application, on his phone or whatever, right? But I think what it asks of the patient or whomever that, is responsible for data input, that has to be able to do that. And I think what the question's asking is really about the reliable solution for, aggregating patient level data. Like, I think there's, to that point about standards or protocols that are emerging, particularly with like electronic health records, with smart apps on fire. I think we'll start seeing better interoperability and being able to consume data depending upon, even if it's not necessarily verticalized. But there's a lot of also, consumer-based applications that we're seeing that have a specific purpose, where they're also doing this sort of data aggregation. So for one example, there's like a surgery management tool where ultimately it's really for, potentially exhausting all of those options before surgery becomes a reality. And being able, so if you're having back pain, you want to be able to exhaust oral medication management, maybe do some physical therapy. So it really, and those are oftentimes requirements from a payer's perspective of being able to show that, you've exhausted all these other options and surgery is your the last case. So, this application, and there's several, would basically track that journey. It's basically decision support tool. Would be able to, capture that level of data from pre-surgery, peri-surgery, post-surgery, including, ultimately visits through an integration with the electronic health record. But I think it would be very like use case specific. It's like this individual is engaged with this practice, and therefore the provider has to be using the application itself. So to Alan's point, I don't know if it exists from at least systematically and across different, the horizontal.
And I'm struck, even at the beginning of the panel, like it's not so much an AI first, AI forward, or any leaning. It's still just an API world. As long as you can develop the correct API and play well with others' APIs, then you should be okay. And so that's really where you have to be focused on.
It's still pretty, last I heard, and I haven't looked into this for a couple of years, so you guys would know better, but it's still pretty problematic, just sort of the APIs. Like I know it used to be that, if you got treated at one hospital and went to a different hospital, different provider system, they would have no idea what drugs you were on and so forth. So they're not even communicating with themselves. I don't know if things have gotten better, but
yeah, that's why I stay on the research side.
Yeah, it hasn't gotten better.
Let me ask you three. My sense of who's in the audience, this would be a good question on behalf of them. Do you mentor entrepreneurs? And if so, how would they find you?
So I can start. I would say myself, not necessarily. I would say yes, but we have much better resources within Anthem itself as a large corporate, whether it's mainly through our innovation program. So I'll just touch on those for a second. Our digital data sandbox obviously provides, one of the largest data assets for entrepreneurs to be able to vet and validate, tune and scale their solutions. And through that, we have a lot of other complementary offerings within the innovation portfolio, one of which is our Anthem Digital Incubator, which does provide mentorship and guidance for entrepreneurs, early stage companies, and potential, capital investment. And then we have our Fast Track to Scale Accelerator, which really is on the implementation side, which takes those incubated companies and is able to pilot those with our clients and lead to integration. So those are all programs that are available. They're well documented, so feel free to look them up.
Great. Yeah. Steve and Erick?
We do some consulting with Straus, but we haven't done. Yeah, I think mentoring is something that's really important for a lot of folks. Don't get mentored, but but it's out there and available. I know USC has a bunch of programs, and I'm sorry I don't know anything off the top of my head, pointers.
That's all right.
Stevens AMI.
Sorry, say it again.
The Stevens Institute and AMI, the Alfred Mann Institute at SC. You can both reach out to them and have some consultations. They've got a lot of great free resources. Caltech does as well. And then because I'm still in the academic space, yeah, I'm always happy to have a conversation, help out where I can with, again, I think the proviso that Spencer had, which is as much time as we have available.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are a lot of, essentially older or retired folks who've been entrepreneurs. And it's a lot that you learn that sort of, even though tech changes, lessons are still there. For example, the mistakes people make about building their team or not building their team appropriately. That, a mentor can really help with. I think mentorship is great. And there are definitely people out there that will help. People have been very successful and they just want to help out.
And I'll point out that I'm the odd man out, that I'm not in Southern California. I live in Austin, Texas, and I do mentor locally. But it's not lost on me that we have 4 white males on this panel. And just to let you know, one of the things I like to do is I try to make sure that my office hours for mentoring are primarily marketed towards people who are underrepresented in the tech industry, to see if I can provide a leg up to people who are trying to break into the industry that might not otherwise have access to that kind of mentorship. So I see we only have 3 minutes left. Before we close down, does anyone want to make any last comments? And oh, you know what? I see that there's one more question. So Michael, let's do this. We'll answer that question and then we'll wrap it up. So Michael says, why are so many of our undergraduate biology programs still so focused on traditional statistical methods versus machine learning? Plus, there are so few undergraduate bioinformatics degrees. It seems like almost a comment than a question, but if anyone knows why that might be the case, it's probably just institutional inertia. But
I can also, as someone who's taken more courses than anyone should ever take in their life, it takes time to build up knowledge and understanding. And so bioinformatics itself, it's really hard to do that. Even the data science programs are sort of coming online now at the bachelor level. They're not there because they're trying to really teach you. They're there because there's demand and they need to make money. So you need to be careful about what the programs are trying to sell you versus what you're actually going to learn. And I think we kind of spoke on it at the beginning about what is AI. Traditional statistics is the basis for that. So if you're not taking traditional statistics, you'll never understand where the stuff breaks. It's the reason why you learn how to do addition multiplication before you start using a calculator. You need to know the bones. And it's tough to hear, but that foundation cannot be replaced, and the hours and the time that you spend will be well worth it down the line.
I completely agree. And I will say, I know USC is doing a lot in data science lately, where those programs are at the graduate level and filtering down to the undergraduate, I believe.
And Caltech has a new data science program, so I'll be careful trotting on that. But I very much like having a couple of things. I think it was once told to me that your bachelor's is a good foundation. Master's, you pick up a tool. PhD, you really develop and learn how to use that. And if you're trying to do too many too quickly, you'll end up with a lot of broad knowledge, but it'll be very difficult to apply that because you haven't really got the real experience that you need with it. And so I think it is useful to have those sort of foundations. And there may be too many academics like me, which is why we have programs like we have.
Well, I only have a few jobs, and one of them is to make sure that we stay on time. And I see that it is 3:29 p.m. here in Austin, so 1:29 there. And so therefore, it's time to wrap up. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone in the audience. I want to say thank you very much to Steve, Spencer, and Eric. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope everyone has a good rest of the AI Life Summit and a good rest of the day. So thanks again to everyone, and look forward to seeing you all soon. All right. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Stephen.